Hello and welcome back to another edition of the LA Times College Football Roundtable. I am your host, USC beat writer Ryan Kartje, joined once again by our UCLA beat writer Ben Bolch. Ben, how you doing today?
Little bit groggy, but coming back from the East Coast, we're both learning this new travel schedule. I didn't get back till around 2 a.m. last night. Had a delay in Chicago, so oh boy, just getting used to this.
Yeah, the full travel experience to only come back to a 1 year old, I will say, is not my favorite way to spend a Sunday. But we are both here. We are alive. Our teams, not so much after this weekend. It was a wild weekend just overall in college football. Five top 15 teams went down. Among them, USC, UCLA also lost in Happy Valley, but might have come out of it with the quarterback. A lot to talk about with both LA teams. But let's start with Minneapolis, where Lincoln Riley, at least from what I saw, was very clearly outmaneuvered by Minnesota coach PJ Fleck. At the beginning of that game, it was clear that Minnesota was trying to set the style of the game as, a run heavy, just sort of ugly Big Ten style of game, kind of similarly to what Michigan did. They played soft coverage against Miller Moss, kind of daring him to throw short, dink and dunk down the field, really not normally USC's style. Basically dared them to run with Woody Marks. And for a while, things were working. Lincoln Riley was giving Woody Marks the ball a lot. He had 20 carries for 134 yards at the start of the fourth quarter. And then for the last 11 minutes of the game, Woody Marks didn't touch the ball one time. Lincoln Riley kind of fell back into the trap of throwing it late. And on two late third and fours, downs that Lincoln Riley has made clear he'll run on with the expectation of running on fourth down as well, tried to throw it down the field both times. One ended up with an interception after Mason Murphy was hit or gave up a pass rush on the right side. So things just went awry for Lincoln Riley and USC in the fourth quarter on Saturday. Obviously, a lot of chances squandered in that game. Ben, how much of that game did you see? What did you think just in general about the way things went down there?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I was asleep by the. We didn't have Big Ten Network in the hotel where I was staying. I had to stay in Altoona, which was about 45 minutes away from State College. So by the time I got back there, had dinner, wanted to watch the game, but they didn't have Big Ten Network. I paid attention on ESPN app as long as I could, and then I fell asleep. But I did wake up to some tweets about the post game that I wanted to ask you about. Lincoln Riley basically shut down a reporter asking one of his players what he thought about the crucial play at the goal line involving Minnesota. And the reporter wanted to ask whether the player thought that it was a touchdown or not, but Lincoln Riley shut him down and shut him off. I want to get your thoughts on that exchange and what you make of that.
Lincoln Riley and the media have had sort of a tense relationship, I would say, over the course of the last couple years, and especially after losses. There have been times where Lincoln has reacted defensively. This was certainly one of those moments, kind of lashing out for no reason. Obviously, he was frustrated. That was obviously the one outburst, but there were a lot of the tone of the entire press conference in general was kind of odd and tense. And it seems like Lincoln Riley's not willing to confront the questions that face this team sometimes. And, we are, as the media, are the conduit for those questions a lot of times, but it's not like we're the only ones asking them. I mean, all you have to do is go on social media at all and see questions about Lincoln Riley's decisions and the offensive line struggles. And while I don't agree with all the narratives going out there online, I do think there are some legitimate questions to be asked about decisions Lincoln Riley has made. I mentioned, just the way he handled game management down the stretch. But I think even more than that, there's this unwillingness to sort of address that things aren't going great in all aspects, and none more so than with the offensive line. I mean, very clearly, you know, the offensive tackles just are a liability at this point. I mentioned the third and four that ended in an interception. Miller Moss didn't have any time to get rid of that ball. That interception is not on Miller Moss. A lot of the mistakes in the offense are not on Miller Moss. There needs to be some sort of solution found to mitigate the issues on the edges, and I'm just not sure what it is. It's really a conundrum, and I'm not really sure, other than maybe changing the offense entirely, what Lincoln Riley is going to do to mitigate that.
Yeah, well, the other big question I have, big picture wise, is Lincoln Riley actually has a worse record at this point in his career than Clay Helton did. And Clay Helton had a Rose Bowl win, two division titles, and a conference championship. And Lincoln Riley has none of those. So my question to you is, at what point will Lincoln Riley become on the hot seat if this continues?
I still think things would have to hit a major slide this season for that to be a serious conversation. But that is a pretty glaring stat. That's a tough one to swallow if you're a USC fan. I do think context is important a little bit. I mean, Clay Helton's recruiting classes had kind of thinned out towards the end. The well wasn't quite as deep when Lincoln Riley took over. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt in that there was a little bit more of a rebuild, and he exceeded expectations in year one, and ever since, has fallen short. So again, I think there are a lot of fair criticisms to be made, and I think we're going to keep talking about this. And I just worry that Lincoln Riley may dig deeper into this us versus them hole. And I don't want to get into a whole conversation about the media's job here, but yeah, I think at a certain point, we're going to have to ask tougher and tougher questions, and he's going to be more and more frustrated with the questions that are being asked. So not always the greatest formula going forward, at least narrative wise. But let's switch gears here and talk a little bit, especially about narrative with UCLA. And I think it's kind of an interesting point in that you look at this loss, 16-point loss to Penn State. They score at the end of the game, basically in garbage time. But you emerge from this game feeling a little bit better about the quarterback position, I think. How are UCLA fans supposed to feel coming out of this loss?
Well, it's kind of like the LSU loss where it's like, okay, we lost. We weren't really in the game, well after halftime, but it was kind of a step forward. But the question is, at what point do these step forwards need to become something tangible? And I think this is the week where it does. You got Minnesota at home. Minnesota clearly is a pretty good team. They just beat USC. They nearly beat Michigan on the road. They're a 5.5 favorite over the Bruins at the Rose Bowl, which I think says a lot. So if, Deshaun Foster keeps saying, I can see, the progress we're making, we're going to get there. You gotta start getting there, right? And I think this is the week where it needs to happen because you look forward on the schedule. There's not a lot of truly. I mean, all the games the rest of the season are winnable, but you've got to point at some that are like realistically winnable. And I would say this and the Fresno State game are the most winnable games left on the schedule. So they need to start paying off some wins under Deshaun Foster. And the big question everybody has going forward is who's going to be UCLA's quarterback. Not sure if you watched the game, Ryan, but Justin Martin showed a lot to me. He completed his first 6 passes, 9 of his first 11. Did not look rattled at all, seemed to grasp Eric Bieniemy's offense and really looked like, the quarterback of the future for this team. So not sure if Ethan Garbers will be back this week. Coach Foster said he was on track to, but that remains to be seen. But I think that UCLA fans were encouraged that, Justin Martin can be a viable quarterback if needed.
This feels like the classic case where you don't rush the starting quarterback back. You see what Justin Martin has coming into this week and then make the decision after that. But I agree. It did feel like there was a little bit more cohesion on this offense than there has been in the past. And maybe that's just a matter of Eric Bieniemy's offense is a little bit better of a match for Justin Martin. I want to get your thoughts on this. There was a stat from that I think sort of plays into UCLA's hand that yesterday, I think I saw it from John Wilner first, is that teams in the Big Ten traveling 2+ time zones are now 1-8 this season. Now, the only win was at the Rose Bowl for Indiana, granted. Yeah. But Minnesota going 2+ time zones may be a positive thing for UCLA.
Potentially, but I'll be interested to see if the fans continue to support UCLA. I know, I did a story about traditional Big Ten school interest in traveling to the Rose Bowl. Minnesota expects to have more than 10,000 fans at this game, so there'll be a huge contingent of red and yellow in the stands. One bit of news that has happened since postgame for UCLA, starting running back TJ Harden tweeted a minor setback for a major comeback, which usually indicates an injury. And he did seem to get a little bit hurt on that wheel route that he took for a 53-yard gain in the second quarter, was kind of limping around, stayed in the game, played the rest of the game, but maybe something happened there that wasn't immediately apparent to the training staff that is going to hold him out now. So we'll talk to Deshaun Foster later today and get an update there, but that could be a big developing situation for UCLA.
Huge game, obviously, for UCLA and the narrative of their season coming up. A similarly massive one for USC up against Penn State. Kind of a similar situation in that you can speak well to the opponent of the opposite team for this next week. What is it about that Penn State defense, especially, that you think would give USC cause for concern?
Well, I think they need to keep the approach they had in the second half against UCLA, where they brought a lot more pressure and were a lot more effective in shutting down Justin Martin, had both their sacks in the second half. So I think that they need to keep that approach from the get-go. My question for Penn State is they've been slow starting all season long. They started slow again against UCLA. Can they get in rhythm early? Because I feel like if they don't, this is a game where USC playing at home can really kind of grab command of the game and not look back. So I think Penn State has to get off to a quick start, and they got to bring a lot of pressure.
That's definitely a must for USC in this situation to get off to a quick start. It has not been a strength of theirs over the course of the last three games, although as Lincoln Riley, when I asked about it in this last post-game press conference, questioned my definition of the word start. So however you want to think about it, they have not been scoring very well at the beginning of games. That will be critical coming up against Penn State. And like you said, that pass rush, I think, is going to be, much more similar to Michigan's than any other team that USC has faced this season. And at this point, they need to find an answer to deal with that, because Miller Moss is going to be under assault in this game, and they're just not going to be able to move the ball enough if he's not going to have that time. Now, whether that means playing more two tight end sets, bringing in an extra blocking running back on plays, I don't know, but they need to get creative. And when we asked Lincoln Riley kind of about that, I think it was the last question of the press conference, he mumbled, "I don't know," and then walked off. So I don't know that inspires confidence in those watching and wondering the same questions, but we will certainly see how they respond this week, because this is a kind of a must-win game for USC in the sense that if they don't, the playoff hopes are pretty much out the window.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about something PJ Fleck said after the game, because it's relevant going into the UCLA game. He said, we're the best 2-3 team in the country. I believe that's their record, right? 2-3. So number one, do you agree with that? And number two, you've probably seen enough of UCLA to have an opinion on how Minnesota matches up with them. Who do you think will win this game Saturday at the Rose Bowl?
I don't disagree with PJ Fleck necessarily. I mean, I can't say that I've watched every 2-3 team in America, but that is better than a 2-3 team. And I watched them pretty closely, come back against Michigan as well. And that's a game Minnesota probably should have won, if not for a decision on the onside kick that was, very controversial. And now suddenly you're talking about a Minnesota team that would be ranked at this point. So I do think this is a team that's better than 2-3. I do think it's a better team than UCLA on the whole. But the question is, can UCLA establish their style of play? And maybe the question is, do they know what their style of play is yet completely? And I'm not totally convinced that Eric Bieniemy has that locked down. I do think PJ Fleck is going to come in with a very clear idea of what Minnesota's identity is. They're going to run the ball, they're going to grind the clock, and they're going to ask Max Brosmer to make good decisions on third and longs, and just kind of hope that it works out. I just think this defense, the way they sort of flooded the secondary with defenders is going to make life hard on Justin Martin, especially if UCLA can't run the ball, which has been obviously an issue all season.
Yeah, I think, if TJ Harden's unable to go, I think that opens things up for Jalen Berger, who actually has looked really good. He's averaged over 5 yards a carry and limited carries, but I've liked what I've seen from him. So, maybe like with Ethan Garbers going down and Justin Martin stepping up, this is Jalen Berger's chance to really show what he has, and maybe he can open some eyes. But man, it's going to be a stiff test against a really physical Minnesota defense. I got to think that, I think that 5.5 line is about right for Minnesota. I feel like that's an accurate assessment of where these teams are right now.
On the flip side, USC, Penn State, I just have a really hard time seeing USC dealing with this pass rush. I think it really just comes down to that. And, if Lincoln Riley is able to scheme up a way to deal with that, great. I think that's a requirement. And even then, it's going to be tough to get Woody Marks going in the same way that they did in this last game, although really impressed with what we've seen out of Woody Marks so far. So I think similarly, this is kind of a close game, probably low scoring, and I just have a hard time seeing USC come out with it. But you never know. What do you think?
I'm going to go with the bounce back for USC. I honestly wasn't like super blown away by Penn State. I mean, I think they're a really good quality physical team, but I didn't think that it was like a world beater type of team. I mean, they were kind of, plotting, not many explosive plays. I mean, as I mentioned, they didn't get a ton of pressure on Justin Martin in the first half, which was a huge surprise to me. I mean, UCLA's offensive line has been a weakness all season long. Now they did have some movement around with some guys that found some answers there, but I still expected Penn State to just thrash this team from the start, and it really didn't. So I think that bodes well for USC. I'm going to pick the Trojans to pull the upset at home this week.
A top tier Big Ten team falling below expectations sure sounds like James Franklin. Well, on that note, we'll have a lot to talk about, I'm sure, next week. Whether we're burying both of our teams' seasons from there, we'll see. But until then, thanks for joining us.